Why don't we, I know it's visible with the lights on. How about lights off? Would you hit that button for me, please? That seems to be better, huh?
Yes.
Okay, so let's walk through lesson 1 here. I'm going to try to be brief, keep it to 30 minutes. If I hit the magic 30-minute mark, you have my permission to yell at me. This is the only time you get to yell at me. All right? So, let's talk about Miller and lesson 1 here. And I've got some headings that are very similar to what are in the book. I try to collapse them, make it easier for me as well as you perhaps. So what this first lesson is about is a little bit of history, a little bit of context, because that's important. You know, it's difficult to understand this course called Learning, which is the foundation of scientific psychology, without having some sense, some education of the history of psychology and the science of psychology. So let's look at philosophy of science and John B. Watson and the emergence of behaviorism. Prior to 1900, psychology was just kind of this pseudo-scientific, unscientific enterprise. Interested in people's thoughts and feelings and not too much interest in their actions. Although that's what most people complain about. People complain about an individual's actions. But historically and even today, the focus is on what goes on inside their head rather than what people are doing. So now comes along this guy, John B. Watson, and approaches this from a very, very different perspective. But before we get to J.B. Watson, let's talk about the problems of psychology, and they're still evident today in pop psychology for sure, and in psychology departments all over America. There's an emphasis on unobservable events as the cause of behavior. That's a significant problem, emphasizing things that you cannot observe as the cause of a person's actions. These unobservable events cannot be measured. So let's follow the logic. You say that an unobservable event is causing someone's behavior, but you can't measure that unobservable event to determine how much of it is there. That seems a little bass-ackwards. And you can't manipulate these unobservable events. You can't demonstrate that this event, when it's present, causes a change in the behavior of this person. You can't increase how much is there, decrease how much is there, remove it, present it. There's no way to scientifically manipulate it. Present, remove, increase, decrease. Because it's unobservable. That's where we were in 1900, and that's where we are to a large extent, over 100 years later in psychology. There's a real resistance to a scientific approach. The other problem that continues on to this day is the use of stories or interpretation to explain behavior. A story or an interpretation. A story is someone telling a story about why. As soon as you ask somebody, why did that happen, they engage in storytelling. When you ask them, what caused that to happen, now what are you requiring that person to do? Report facts. What? No storytelling, no interpretation. I want facts. When the cops come to you because somebody broke in your house, do you tell them a story about why? Well, I had a big stereo in there, and I had this big camera, and I had lots of drugs. interested in. Why? They want the facts. What happened? What time of day? Were you alone? Was the door locked? Did you have a sign on the door that said, "Come in, rob me, I have lots of money and drugs"? Facts, not stories, not interpretation. A scientific approach looks for facts, looks for causes that we can observe. Then came John B. Watson, 1912, president of the American Psychological Association, and he gave his 1912 APA address. Psychology as a behaviorist views it. John B. Watson laid out the philosophy of behaviorism, the philosophy of science, which came to be called behaviorism. A philosophy of science describes how we approach the study of this phenomenon called human behavior, animal behavior. How do we do that? What are our rules? What are our assumptions? That's the philosophy of science. Came to be called behaviorism. Watson laid out a natural science approach. Natural science like biology, chemistry, physics, geology, also known as the hard sciences. Not hard because they're difficult, hard sciences because they use a natural science approach, relying on observable events, measurable events, manipulable events to demonstrate cause and effect or functional relations. That's 1912, John B. Watson. A fundamental change in the direction of psychology. For psychology to be successful, regarded as something meaningful, useful, it needed to move away from explanatory fictions. Those are called interpretations, hypothetical constructs, creating fictitious structures inside your body that are supposedly the cause of your behavior. And those structures can never be observed, and they cannot be measured nor manipulated. That's got to stop. This is John B. Watson laying out the philosophy of science. Watson laid out the framework, as I've described, for the next approximate 15, 20 years of how psychology, scientific psychology, approached the topic. Watson was also very influenced by Ivan Pavlov, a contemporary of his. Pavlov won the 1912 Nobel Prize for Science. So, hey, influenced by a Nobel laureate, think that's kind of the way you want to go? Powerful, influential person influencing the president of the American Psychological Association. Pavlov, we unfortunately won't be able to study him, but just as a taste, Pavlov didn't discover, but he really thoroughly researched what came to be called classical conditioning, another basic process of learning. So because Watson was influenced by Pavlov, Watson's model of behavior and learning and conditioning was called stimulus response. You present a stimulus and it causes a response, sort of like a knee jerk. Stimulus response. And lastly, Watson, to this day, is called the father of behaviorism. You can consider it this first generation of behaviorism that Watson developed. Now, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and downright lies about John B. Watson. So we're going to clarify those. Watson did not say humans don't think. He did not say that. He acknowledged that human beings think. But thinking is not an observable behavior. So it presents a serious challenge. He did not say that humans have no emotion. He acknowledged people have feelings and emotion, but emotion is not observable. It presents a significant challenge. He was interested in studying both of those things. And in fact, he did early research on measuring the muscle activity of the vocal cords, which he hypothesized the strength of those muscle contractions correlated with, meaning associated with, related to, an individual's thinking in that moment. So he was interested in this complex behavior. He didn't say it didn't exist. That's absolutely false. He said it's difficult to study. We need to stay above ground and focus on observable events and be a natural science. Then we have B.F. Skinner from 1938 to 1991 when he died. 1938 is when he first became productive. Okay? Skinner conducted pioneering research with rats and pigeons, and he refined and he discovered laws of behavior that work across species. A law is a fact. It's not a story. It's not an interpretation. It's a fact. There are no exceptions. Skinner clarified what was first discussed by E.L. Thorndike in 1912, the law of effect. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Skinner emphasized reinforcement, which is one of the laws of effect. Skinner also described operant behavior. Operant is a word that he coined. And if you read Skinner, and I encourage you to do that, I can turn you on to the really exciting, interesting, challenging books that can potentially change your life. Operant is a behavior that operates on the environment. That's an operant. It operates on something in the environment. That something is called an operandum. Okay? An operant. Operant behavior is regulated, controlled, influenced by the consequences that behavior produces. That's operant behavior. It's regulated, influenced, controlled by the consequences that behavior produces. Now, when I say control, that might give you the heebie-jeebies, or it may give you a tingle up your spine. Let's hope it's the tingle up your spine. What we're talking about is scientific language. In science, the goal is to control variables and to manipulate variables in a systematic fashion so that you can determine the extent to which that variable controls the phenomenon under study. We're doing science. Influence, regulate, or control. Operant conditioning. This is the process by which environmental events, primarily consequences, come to regulate the occurrence of a behavior. Operant conditioning, the process by which environmental events, primarily consequences, come to regulate behavior. Operant conditioning. Skinner built upon Watson's behaviorism. Watson had a good starting point, and Skinner was a brilliant scientist. He built upon Watson's statement of behaviorism, elaborated upon it, and described in 1969 radical behaviorism. And a quick summary of radical behaviorism is, all that an organism does is behave. That organism behaves publicly, what we can observe with our eyes, and that organism has behavior that occurs under the skin, but it's still behaving. To have a complete analysis of behavior, we need to analyze both public behavior and private behavior, that which is under the skin. And that private behavior follows the same principles of behavior as the public behavior. So now, from 1912 to 1969, we've gone a considerable distance. Watson was arguing for a natural science. Skinner is still arguing for a natural science. But we need to apply that natural science to public and private behavior. What people call thinking, cognition, what people call feelings, emotion. Because those are behaviors too, subject to the same principles of behavior as overt behavior. Skinner conducted hundreds of experiments demonstrating laws of behavior that worked across species. From goldfish to monkeys to rats to pigeons to human beings. He advocated for the development of culture and society that was based on principles of reinforcement. Skinner argued vociferously against the use of punishment, against the use of discipline. He promoted a humane society based on positive reinforcement, strengthening desired behavior through reinforcement. In 1957, Skinner wrote the book Verbal Behavior, which was a behavior analysis of language, how people acquire language, how they learn language. That book in 1957 has resulted in the most effective language intervention for children with autism spectrum disorder. And about 40% of those kids with ASD are nonverbal. And now with Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior and its application, we can teach those kids to speak. The most effective intervention. Skinner had hundreds of students who went on to be pioneers themselves, eminent psychologists that also were presidents of multiple professional associations, including the American Psychological Association, the Association for the Advancement of Behavior Therapy, Association for Behavior Analysis. Pioneers demonstrating that principles of behavior could be applied across the lifespan to challenging behaviors and to everyday living. We're not limited to just the most difficult problems, although that's where behavior analysis started. They were given the worst cases because people wanted behavior analysts to fail. And the opposite came to be true. Behavior analysis is a powerful science to improve people's lives. Skinner remains the most widely cited psychologist to this day, and the most influential. Let's talk about principles. A principle is how something works. The law is the general statement. This works across all species. So when we apply principles of behavior to socially significant problems, that's called applied behavior analysis. And as I said, behavior analysts started out with the most difficult cases, the ones that couldn't be cured. And they were successful using these principles. Principles of behavior analysis were applied to medical problems. When that's done, it's called behavioral medicine. I do that intermittently in my practice. My research over the past some 20 years has been behavioral medicine research related to a neurological disorder. So once again, we're not limited to the most severe problems. We have a lot of examples of how people can benefit, but it can be applied to everyday behavior. Public versus private events, or public versus private behavior. Public. A public event or a public behavior. This is a behavior that can be observed by more than one person while the behavior is being performed. So I'm talking to you, and we have many, many eyes in the classroom today, which means more than one person can observe me speaking, correct? Okay. Now, if everybody packed up and I continued to speak, would that be a public event? No, because the only person who can observe my speaking would be me. That would make it a private event. Private events are behaviors that are only observable to the person performing that behavior. But it's still a behavior. I can't emphasize this enough, so that's why it's here again, or I'm talking about it again. Feelings are behavior. That's the F word, by the way. Thinking is behavior. When you engage in thinking, it is an action. Behavior is the action of the organism. All that organisms do is behave. And you happen to be an organism, just like me. People report that a feeling caused them to act. I felt angry, therefore I hit my house with my car, drove my car into my house. Boom. Okay? I was thinking about smacking my kid upside the head, so I did. problems with saying that feelings cause behavior and thinking causes behavior. The first problem is that thinking is a behavior. Behavior does not cause another behavior. One behavior does not cause another behavior. The other problem is you have to ask the question, well, what caused the thinking? No one's denying that you're thinking, or that you are feeling something, or you have an emotion. No one's denying that. But you have to ask the question, what's causing that feeling? What's causing that emotion, which is behavior? And once we identify the cause of the thinking, the cause of the emotion, now we can walk through this sequentially. Okay, this environmental event occurred, you began to engage in this kind of self-talk, and shortly later you engaged in some overt public action. But it was the environmental event that caused both types of behavior. In other words, we still have to explain the cause of the private event. It just doesn't stand alone and we walk away after we say, I had a feeling and then I did that. No, we have to ask and explain what caused that thinking, what caused that feeling, to have a complete analysis of the situation. Oops, whoa. Am I done so soon? I guess so. Any questions? Yes.
So you said behavior can't influence another behavior.
Behavior doesn't cause other behavior.
So, like, feeling angry can't make me be a certain way, or that's not a justification for me acting.
Feeling angry is a behavior.
Mm-hmm. So,
and then you smack your wife. That's another behavior too.
So it's not, being angry is not a justification for doing something else.
When you say justification, do you mean cause?
Yes.
Because justification sounds like, well, I was angry, so I get to hit her. That's a justification.
Yeah.
We're talking science, not trying to escape, rationalize why you beat on somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So, what we are saying is that thinking and emotions are behavior. And you engage in thinking, that doesn't cause this motor action, hitting. They're two different behaviors. The question is, what causes the thinking? What causes the public behavior of hitting? Because if we just walk away and say, okay, he was thinking he should hit her, what caused the thinking? Where in the environment is the cause of your thinking? Did she call you a nasty name? Did she say, oh, I'm sleeping with your brother? If she said, oh, I'm sleeping with your brother, that's an environmental event, right? And you get pissed off and you smack her.
But there's two different reasons why you hit her, and then why you thought of, like, you got mad about it.
One reason. One cause. She said, I'm sleeping with your brother. And you engaged in two different behaviors that occurred very close in time to each other. I'm going to smack you, bitch. And you did. And we trace it back to the environment. That's where that is. That's where that is.
So a private behavior is like never the reason for a public behavior.
And you keep using the word reason. Cause. Cause. We're doing science. When you're doing science, we're looking for relationships. That means things are associated. But when we're looking at cause, one thing, I'm going to use loosey-goosey, sloppy, everyday language only today. That one event then triggers this event. The occurrence of this event causes that event. Cause. Relation, this is a good example. Relation, associated with, related to. So your significant other of the week says, I'm sleeping with your brother. You say to yourself, self-talk, I'm going to smack you, bitch. Bang. Saying I'm going to smack you, bitch, and hitting her is, those two events are related. The cause was that environmental event. Okay? Make sense? Questions? That's a great question. It's an excellent question. Good example, I get to talk dirty. Yeah.
So operant conditioning is voluntary?
Oh, that's a good question too. Quotes. Voluntary. This is a difficult, psychology's tough unless you have general psychology, right?
That was fun.
Scientific psychology is tough because it's science. There's an emphasis to try to make things simple. And what often happens is that as people try to make it simple, they make it wrong. So, and I know that Miller used the word voluntary. And I'm going to give an example why I'm going to argue that that ain't right. Okay? Here's my example. This is a study done in mid to late 60s by a very well-respected scientist, Neil Miller. He had a little rat. And that rat had little sensors on its ears, right and left ear. Okay? And he had those sensors measuring blood pressure in the veins of the rat's left ear and right ear. You have blood pressure, right? Now, right now, I want you to increase your blood pressure. Do it. Can you do that?
No.
Why? Because it's involuntary, right? Okay? Neil Miller, little rat, sensors on the ears, gave the rat feedback, auditory feedback, for minute changes in the blood pressure of the left ear. When minute changes in blood pressure of the left ear increased, the little rat got feedback. When the blood pressure didn't increase, no feedback. Increase, feedback. We have a contingent relationship between when this response goes up, we present a reinforcer, feedback. Doesn't go up, no reinforcer, goes up, we present a reinforcer, goes up on the left ear. Involuntary? Or a behavior that's regulated by the consequences it produces. Operant behavior. There's an artificial line drawn in the sand. This is voluntary, this is involuntary. That's just to make life easy. Life is far more complex, as we will see. Okay? Any other questions? That's a good one too. Have I exhausted my 30 minutes of infamy? Then you should be yelling at me.
I have one more question, actually.
That'll work.
Okay. Why did Skinner, why did he push for positive reinforcement? What's wrong with negative reinforcement?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to digress ever so slightly, and I'm going to make multiple assumptions, all right? My first assumption is that you know what negative reinforcement is. Mm-hmm. Can you tell me?
You take something away.
No, you don't.
Or,
well, you
no,
do,
you,
but what do you take away?
Wait, what?
You do, but what do you take away?
You take away the painful stimulus.
Yeah, painful, aversive, okay. Yeah, you remove an aversive stimulus. Raise your hand if you want me to give you something that's aversive, painful right now. Nobody wants that. Because you start out with an aversive condition. It's true that negative reinforcement can increase the rate of responding, but I don't want to be in an aversive environment. And I will digress ever so slightly. True story. Okay? My wife works in some weird...
You didn't hit her in this story, did you?
Pardon? Did I call her you bitch and stuff? No, I didn't. Okay. So she worked at a very high-power corporate multinational bank, doing some really exotic stuff. And she would go in and do her job, and her supervisor would say, "You're just not good enough. That's not fast enough. You're just not good enough. That's not fast enough." So that's kind of aversive, right? You're not good enough. We're going to have to put you on the program, which is one step to termination. So now we just increase the aversiveness, right? Now, how is this going to work? You increase the aversive work environment, and the person is going to do what? Work quicker? Work faster? Work with fewer errors after you increase the aversiveness? No. People don't want that. So it's a recipe to fail. All that does is elicit a lot of, ready? Emotional behavior. Okay? And then people escape. Get the fuck out of here. All right, I've exhausted my 30 minutes. Mini lecture 1. We'll see you on Tuesday. Thanks, good questions, I appreciate it. Keep them coming. Makes class interesting, doesn't it?